The winter wind howled through the narrow streets of downtown Chicago, where a small figure in an oversized blue jacket hurried along the sidewalk. At just 12 years old, Ray had mastered the art of staying warm with layers of donated clothes, each piece telling its own story of kindness from strangers. His grandmother had carefully sewn extra padding into the jacket's lining last winter, and though the sleeves now barely reached his wrists, he refused to part with it. Every morning, while other kids his age rushed to school with backpacks and lunchboxes, Ray would help elderly Mr. Parker, who lived in the same shelter, set up his spot near the subway entrance. They had a routine. Ray would spread out the cardboard to keep Mr. Parker off the cold ground, and in return, the old man would share stories about his days as a jazz musician, playing in smoky clubs that had long since closed their doors. "You know what, kid?" Mr. Parker would say, adjusting his worn wool hat. "Life's like jazz. Sometimes you got improvise, but you never lose the rhythm." Ray would smile, understanding more than most children his age ever needed to. He had been improvising with his grandmother since he was 7, when they first moved into the shelter after their apartment building was sold to developers. His grandmother, though exhausted from working 3 different cleaning jobs, never let their circumstances dim her spirit. She had taught Ray that their situation was temporary, but their character was permanent. "We might not have much," she would say while heating up donated soup on the shelter's shared microwave, "but we've got something money can't buy, a heart that knows how to give." And give they did. Ray would share his extra sandwich with Tommy, a younger boy who had recently arrived at the shelter with his mom. His grandmother would spend her rare free evenings teaching other shelter residents how to read, her patience never wearing thin even when progress was slow. They had created their own kind of family within these challenging circumstances. Between helping others and collecting recyclables to earn a few extra dollars, Ray had developed a daily routine. He knew which coffee shops would give away day-old pastries, which library security guards would let him stay a little longer to finish his homework, and which street corners were safest when the sun began to set. The shelter's common room had become his after-school study spot, where he'd spread his textbooks across the wobbly table, determined to keep his grades up despite everything. His grandmother had always emphasized that education was their ticket to a better life, and Ray took this to heart, often studying by the dim light of the shelter's fluorescent bulbs long after others had gone to sleep. That morning had started like any other. Ray had helped serve breakfast to the shelter's newest families, made sure his grandmother had her warm gloves for work, and headed out to check on his usual spots for recyclables. The financial district was always good for bottles and cans, especially after lunch when office workers would crowd the sidewalks, coffee cups and water bottles in hand. Little did he know that this ordinary Tuesday would become the day everything changed. As he made his way past the gleaming skyscrapers, their windows reflecting the weak winter sun, Ray couldn't have imagined that fate had placed something extraordinary in his path, something that would test his character, challenge his values, and ultimately reshape his entire world. His grandmother's words echoed in his mind as he walked. Sometimes the biggest blessings come disguised as the hardest choices. He pulled his jacket tighter against the cold, unaware that he was about to discover just how true those words could be. The morning traffic hummed around him, car horns and train whistles creating the soundtrack of another day on the streets, a day that was about to become anything but ordinary. The morning sun had barely warmed the city streets when Ray noticed something unusual glinting beneath a cafe table. At first, he thought it was just another discarded food wrapper, the kind that usually filled his recycling bags. But as he got closer, the rich brown leather caught his eye. It was a wallet, and not the kind you'd find at a discount store. He picked it up carefully, surprised by its weight. The leather was butter soft, the kind that spoke of boardrooms and business deals, not street corners and shelter beds. For a moment, he just stood there, feeling the morning rush hour crowd flow around him like a river around a stone. "Hey kid, you gonna buy something or just stand there?" called out the cafe worker, wiping down the outdoor tables. Ray quickly stepped away, his heart beating faster. He'd found lost items before, phones, umbrellas, even a child's teddy bear once, but nothing quite like this. Finding a quiet spot between 2 buildings, Ray opened the wallet. His eyes widened at what he saw inside. There were credit cards. Gold, platinum, black, their metallic surfaces catching the light. But what made his breath catch was the cash. More money than he'd ever seen in one place, crisp hundreds neatly folded together. The kind of money that could buy warm winter coats for everyone in the shelter, or maybe even. He stopped that thought before it could take root. His grandmother's voice echoed in his head. The true test of a person isn't what they do when everyone's watching, but what they do when no one is. Looking further into the wallet, he found the owner's driver's license. The photo showed an Asian man with kind eyes and a subtle smile, wearing what looked like a very expensive suit. The name read Michael Zhang, with an address in the city's wealthiest neighborhood. A quick Google search on his phone, a basic model his grandmother had insisted he have for safety, revealed that Mr. Zhang wasn't just rich. He was the CEO of one of the biggest tech companies in the country. Ray sat down on a nearby bench, the wallet heavy in his hands. The morning crowd rushed past. Business people clutching coffee cups, construction workers heading to their sites, office cleaners finishing their night shifts. Each person wrapped in their own world, none of them aware of the battle being fought in the heart of a 12-year-old boy. He thought about the shelter, about how the director had announced yesterday that funding was getting tight. He thought about Mr. Parker's cough that seemed to be getting worse, about Tommy's mom who couldn't afford his asthma medicine. The money in this wallet could help so many people. But then he remembered last summer when his grandmother had found a $20 bill on the street. She'd spent 2 hours going from shop to shop, asking if anyone had lost it. When no one claimed it, she'd used it to buy ice cream, not just for Ray, but for all the kids in the shelter. Money comes and goes, she'd said, handing out the drippy cones, but doing the right thing sticks with you forever. Ray pulled out his phone again, this time looking up the address of Zhang Technologies. It was about 30 blocks away, in one of those super tall buildings that seemed to touch the clouds. He checked his pocket. He had exactly $2.75, enough for a bus ride. Before heading to the bus stop, Ray made a quick call to Mr. Parker. "Could you tell my grandmother I'm going to be late today? There's something important I need to do." The old man agreed, though Ray could hear the curiosity in his voice. As he waited for the bus, Ray watched a group of kids his age walking to school, laughing and pushing each other playfully. His life was so different from theirs, but his grandmother always said that didn't make him any less worthy. "It's not where you live that matters," she would say, "it's how you live." The bus arrived with a hiss of brakes, and Ray climbed aboard, clutching the wallet close. As the city scenery changed from familiar neighborhood shops to gleaming corporate towers, he thought about how this wallet probably represented pocket change to its owner. Yet here he was, heading into a world he'd only seen from a distance, all because of a choice between what was easy and what was right. The bus wound through the city streets, and with each passing block, Ray's determination grew stronger. He didn't know exactly what would happen when he reached that tall building, or how he'd even get past the security desk, but he knew one thing for certain. He was going to return this wallet, not because anyone was watching, but because that's who his grandmother had raised him to be. The glass and steel building seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky as Ray stood at its base, neck craning to see the top. People in expensive suits streamed past him through the revolving doors, their shoes clicking against the polished marble floor inside. His own worn sneakers felt suddenly very out of place. Taking a deep breath, Ray pushed through the revolving door. The lobby was like nothing he'd ever seen, all shiny surfaces and soft lighting, with a massive fountain in the center that probably used more water in a day than the shelter did in a week. A security desk stretched across the entrance, staffed by 3 guards in crisp uniforms. "Can I help you?" one of the guards asked, his tone making it clear that he didn't think Ray belonged there. Ray's throat felt dry, but he squared his shoulders like his grandmother taught him. "I need to see Mr. Zhang," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's important." The guard exchanged looks with his colleagues. "Do you have an appointment?" he asked, though they all knew the answer. Ray shook his head but pulled out the wallet. "I found his wallet," he explained. "I want to return it to him personally." "Right," the guard said, clearly skeptical. "Why don't you just leave it here with us? We'll make sure he gets it." He reached for the wallet, but Ray pulled it back slightly. His grandmother's voice echoed in his head. "Trust your instincts, but always be respectful." "Sir," Ray said politely, "I know you're doing your job, but this wallet has a lot of important things in it. I'd really like to give it to Mr. Zhang myself." He thought about adding that there was also a lot of cash inside, but decided against it. Something told him that might make things more complicated. The guards huddled together, speaking in low voices. Ray could feel other people in the lobby starting to stare. A woman in high heels gave him a wide berth as she walked past, clutching her designer purse closer. He was used to these looks, but they still stung. Just then, a young woman in a blazer approached the security desk. She'd been watching the scene unfold, and something about Ray's determination had caught her attention. "What's going on here?" she asked. The guard explained the situation, and the woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Chen, an executive assistant, looked thoughtfully at Ray. "You found Mr. Zhang's wallet?" she asked. Ray nodded, explaining where and when he'd found it. "And you came all this way to return it?" she pressed. "Why not just turn it in to the police?" Ray thought about this for a moment. "Because," he said slowly, "when someone helps you, you remember their face. Maybe Mr. Zhang might remember mine, and someday," he trailed off, not wanting to sound like he was asking for anything. Mrs. Chen smiled, something shifting in her expression. "Wait here," she said, heading to a sleek elevator. Ray stood nervously, aware of the guards still watching him closely. He thought about the shelter, about his grandmother who would be finishing her first job of the day about now. He hoped she wouldn't worry when Mr. Parker told her he was running late. 10 minutes felt like an hour, but finally Mrs. Chen returned. "Mr. Zhang will see you," she said, much to the guard's surprise. "Follow me." As Ray walked past the security desk, he gave them a small smile. His grandmother always said that responding to suspicion with kindness was like fighting fire with water. The elevator ride was smooth and silent, nothing like the creaky one at the shelter. They went up so high that Ray's ears popped. He watched the floor numbers climb. 10, 20, 30, 40, finally stopping at 52. The doors opened to reveal an entire floor of glass walls and modern furniture. Mrs. Chen led him through a maze of desks where people were typing on computers or talking on phones. Some looked up curiously as he passed. Ray clutched the wallet tighter, suddenly very aware of his mismatched socks and the small tear in his jacket sleeve that his grandmother hadn't had time to mend yet. They reached a large corner office with views of the entire city. Ray could see the shelter district from up here, looking so small and far away. And there, standing by a large desk, was Mr. Zhang himself. He looked exactly like his driver's license photo, but taller in person, wearing a suit that probably cost more than everything in the shelter combined. "So," Mr. Zhang said, his voice surprisingly warm, "you're the young man who found my wallet." He gestured for Ray to sit in one of the leather chairs facing his desk. "Tell me about yourself." Ray carefully placed the wallet on the desk between them, noting how Mr. Zhang made no move to check its contents. Instead, the man's eyes stayed focused on Ray, as if he was seeing something much more interesting than a lost wallet. And so, sitting in that tower high above the city, Ray began to tell his story, not knowing that this moment, this decision to do the right thing, was about to change everything. But that's often how life works, his grandmother would say later. The biggest changes don't announce themselves with fanfare. They slip in quietly, disguised as small choices made on ordinary days. The afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Mr. Zhang's office, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Ray sat in the oversized leather chair, trying not to fidget as he told his story. He talked about living in the shelter with his grandmother, about helping Mr. Parker in the mornings, and about finding the wallet. "I just knew I had to return it," Ray explained, his hands folded in his lap. "My grandmother always says that doing the right thing isn't a choice, it's just who you are." Mr. Zhang listened intently, his expression thoughtful. He hadn't even opened the wallet yet, which surprised Ray. Instead, he kept watching Ray with an odd look in his eyes, as if trying to solve a puzzle. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman," Mr. Zhang said finally. "Where is she now?" "She's probably starting her second job at the hospital," Ray replied. "She cleans there from 2 to 8, then goes to clean offices at night." He said this without shame. His grandmother had taught him that honest work was always honorable. As Ray shifted in his chair, the collar of his jacket slipped slightly, revealing a small birthmark on his neck. A distinctive pattern that looked almost like a crescent moon. Mr. Zhang's eyes widened suddenly, and he sat forward in his chair. "That birthmark," he said, his voice different now. "How long have you had it?" Ray touched his neck self-consciously. All my life. My grandmother says I was born with it. He noticed Mr. Zhang had gone very pale. Sir, are you okay? Mr. Zhang stood up abruptly and walked to the window, his back to Ray. The office was quiet except for the distant hum of the city below. When he turned around, his face had composed itself, but his eyes were intense. Tell me, Ray, he said carefully, what do you know about your parents? The question caught Ray off guard. This wasn't how he'd expected the conversation to go. Not much, he admitted. My mom died when I was really little. I never knew my dad. My grandmother adopted me after Mom passed away. Mr. Zhang pressed a button on his desk phone. Mrs. Chen, could you come in here? And bring me that file from 15 years ago, the one about my sister. Ray sat quietly, confusion growing. Why was Mr. Zhang asking about his family? What did any of this have to do with returning a wallet? Mrs. Chen entered with a thick folder, handing it to Mr. Zhang before stepping back. Mr. Zhang opened it and pulled out an old photograph, studying it for a long moment before looking back at Ray. 15 years ago, he began slowly, my younger sister disappeared. She was young, scared, and pregnant. We searched for months but never found her. He paused, his fingers tracing the edge of the photograph. She had the same birthmark as you. Ray's heart began to pound. The room suddenly felt too warm, too small. Mr. Zhang continued, his voice gentle. She would have given birth around the time you were born. And in all my years, I've only ever seen that particular birthmark in our family. Ray's thoughts spun like autumn leaves in a windstorm. Could it be possible? Was this why his grandmother sometimes got a sad look when he asked about his mom? Why she had no photos from before he was a baby? Would you mind if we did a DNA test? Mr. Zhang asked softly, just to be sure. Ray nodded, still trying to process everything. Mr. Zhang made a phone call, and within minutes, a doctor from the building's medical center arrived with testing kits. The process was quick, just a simple cheek swab. But Ray felt like everything was moving in slow motion. The results will take a few days, the doctor explained. We'll rush them, but these things take time. Mr. Zhang thanked the doctor, then turned back to Ray. Regardless of what the test shows, I want you to know something. You coming here today, returning my wallet, that showed incredible character. Whether you're my nephew or not, I'm impressed by who you are. Ray thought about his grandmother, probably mopping hospital floors right now. Sir, he said carefully, if the test shows we're related, what happens then? Mr. Zhang sat back down, his expression serious. Then we figure it out together. But first, I'd like to meet your grandmother. She's clearly done an amazing job raising you. Just then, Mrs. Chen poked her head in. Mr. Zhang, your next meeting is in 5 minutes. Mr. Zhang nodded, then wrote something on a business card. This is my personal number, he said, handing it to Ray. Call me tomorrow after school. We'll arrange to meet with your grandmother. As Ray stood to leave, Mr. Zhang stopped him. Oh, and Ray, thank you for returning my wallet. Not many people would have made that choice. Ray smiled, thinking of his grandmother's words about character. Actually, sir, I think more people would than you might expect. Sometimes they just need a chance to prove it. Walking back to the elevator with Mrs. Chen, Ray felt like he was floating. The day had started with him finding a wallet, and now everything might change. But one thing wouldn't. He knew his grandmother would still be his grandmother, no matter what any test showed. As he stepped out of the building and into the late afternoon sun, Ray looked up at the towering structure behind him. Somewhere up there, a man who might be his uncle was probably thinking about him too. He pulled out his phone to call Mr. Parker. His grandmother needed to know he'd be home for dinner tonight. They had a lot to talk about. Ray barely slept that night, his mind racing with questions. His grandmother had listened quietly when he told her everything that had happened at Zhang Technologies. She didn't seem surprised, not exactly, but something in her eyes had changed, like she'd been carrying a heavy secret that was finally coming to light. The next afternoon, they sat together in a different kind of waiting room than they were used to. Instead of the crowded shelter common area, this one had soft leather chairs and modern art on the walls. Mr. Zhang's private office building was a far cry from their usual surroundings. Grandma, Ray said softly, noticing how she kept smoothing her worn but clean dress, are you okay? She took his hand, her own bearing the marks of years of hard work. Sometimes, she said, life has a way of bringing truth to light, no matter how long it takes. Before Ray could ask what she meant, Mr. Zhang appeared in the doorway. The meeting that followed felt like something from a dream. Mr. Zhang had brought files, old photographs, and documents that told a story Ray had never known. His mother, Mr. Zhang's sister, had been young and scared when she found out she was pregnant. She'd left home, wanting to make her own way in the world. Your mother was stubborn and independent, Mr. Zhang explained, his voice thick with emotion. She wouldn't accept help, wanted to prove she could handle everything on her own. He pulled out a photograph of a young woman with kind eyes and the same crescent-shaped birthmark as Ray. This was her, just before she disappeared. Ray's grandmother squeezed his hand tighter as she looked at the photo. I remember the day she came to the shelter, she said quietly. She was 7 months pregnant, determined to give her baby a good life despite having nothing. I was working there as a cleaner back then. The story unfolded like pieces of a puzzle finally coming together. Ray's mother had stayed at the shelter until he was born. His grandmother, who had lost her own daughter years before, formed a special bond with the young mother. When complications arose during childbirth, his mother had made his grandmother promise to take care of her baby. She didn't tell me about her family, his grandmother explained, wiping away tears. She only said she couldn't go back. I tried to find her relatives after she passed, but she had used a different name at the shelter. I legally adopted you, Ray, because I had promised her I would keep you safe and loved. Mr. Zhang sat back in his chair, running a hand over his face. We searched for her for years. Private investigators, missing persons reports, everything led nowhere. We never knew she had used another name, never knew she had her baby. The DNA test results lay on the desk between them, confirming what they all now knew to be true. Ray was indeed Mr. Zhang's nephew, the son of his long-lost sister. But the paper felt less important than the stories and memories being shared in that room. I used to see it, his grandmother said softly, touching Ray's birthmark. Every time I looked at this mark, I knew you must have family out there somewhere. But I promised your mother I would keep you safe, give you a stable home. Even when things got hard, even when we ended up back at the shelter, I knew I had to keep that promise. Mr. Zhang reached across the desk and took his grandmother's other hand. You did more than keep him safe, he said, his voice full of gratitude. You taught him values that money can't buy. When he brought back my wallet yesterday, I saw my sister's spirit in him, that same determination to do what's right. Ray looked between these two adults, his grandmother who had raised him with love despite having so little, and his uncle who had spent years searching for a sister he'd never stopped loving. Both had lost so much, and now here they all were, brought together by a lost wallet and a birthmark. What happens now? Ray asked, voicing the question that hung in the air. Mr. Zhang leaned forward. Now we honor both the past and the present. Your grandmother has been your constant, your foundation. That doesn't change. But if you're both willing, I'd like to be part of your lives too. There's so much to catch up on, so many stories to share. The afternoon sun painted long shadows across the office floor as they talked about possibilities. Mr. Zhang spoke of education funds and better housing, but also of family dinners and shared holidays. Ray's grandmother talked about her dreams for his future, dreams she'd held onto even when their circumstances were at their hardest. As they made plans to meet again the next day, Ray noticed both his grandmother and Mr. Zhang had the same look in their eyes, a mix of hope and healing, as if an old wound was finally beginning to close. Walking out of the building, Ray held his grandmother's hand just as he had when he was small. "Grandma," he said, watching the sunset paint the city buildings in gold, "are you happy about all this?" She stopped and turned to him, her eyes bright with tears and joy. "Happiness isn't just about what we gain," she said, wisdom in her voice. "It's about what we share, and now we have more love to share than ever before." Above them, in his office, Mr. Zhang watched them walk away, holding a photo of his sister close to his heart. Sometimes, he thought, the greatest treasures come disguised as ordinary moments, like a boy finding a wallet on a cold morning in Chicago. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of emotions and discoveries. Mr. Zhang had invited Ray and his grandmother to his home for dinner, a beautiful house overlooking the lake that made Ray's eyes wide with wonder. But it wasn't the fancy furniture or the huge TV that caught his attention. It was the wall of family photos in the living room. "These are your grandparents," Mr. Jung said softly, pointing to a picture of an elderly couple. "And this?" He paused at a photo of a young girl with bright eyes and a mischievous smile. "This is your mother when she was about your age." Ray stood there, taking in every detail. He had his mother's eyes, he realized, and the way she smiled. His grandmother had always said his smile lit up a room, just like he could see in this photograph. For the first time in his life, he was seeing pieces of himself in someone else's face. "She was always the brave one," Mr. Jung continued, his voice thick with memory. "When we were kids, she'd be the first to climb the highest tree, the first to stand up to bullies at school. She had such a strong sense of justice." He looked at Ray. "Just like you." Ray's grandmother sat quietly on the couch, watching this moment unfold. She pulled out an old, worn envelope from her purse. "I think it's time you had this," she said. "Your mother wrote it the day before." She paused, gathering strength. "The day before the complications started." With trembling hands, Ray opened the envelope. The letter inside was written in neat, careful handwriting. "My dearest Paddy, by the time you read this, you'll be old enough to understand. I want you to know that leaving you was the hardest choice I've ever made, but staying might have been harder. I was young and scared, but that's no excuse for running away from family who loved me. The wonderful woman who's been taking care of us at the shelter, she has so much love to give. I've seen how she looks at you, like you're the most precious thing in the world. I know in my heart she'll give you everything I wish I could. Maybe someday you'll meet my brother, your uncle. He has the kindest heart, even though he pretends to be all business. I hope you'll forgive me for keeping you from him. I hope he'll forgive me too. Remember that you were born from love, even if I wasn't brave enough to accept all the love that was offered to me. Be braver than I was. Be kinder. Be everything I know you can be. All my love, Mom." The room was quiet except for the soft sound of tears. Mr. Jung had his face in his hands, shoulders shaking slightly. Ray's grandmother moved to sit beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "She was so young," his grandmother said softly. "She used to sit in the shelter's garden, talking to you before you were born, making plans. She wanted you to have everything she didn't think she deserved." "Did she?" Ray's voice cracked a little. "Did she suffer? At the end?" His grandmother shook her head. "No, sweetheart. It was quick. A complication nobody could have prevented. She held you, loved you, and made me promise to keep you safe. Her last words were about how beautiful you were." Mr. Jung wiped his eyes and stood up, walking to a cabinet. He returned with a small wooden box. "These belong to your mother," he said, opening it to reveal a collection of treasures: a delicate silver bracelet, some old photographs, a high school diploma, and a small diary. "She left these with me the day she disappeared," he explained. I think maybe she always planned to come back someday. She just ran out of time." As they sat together, looking through the box, stories began to flow. Mr. Jung told tales of their childhood, how their mother would make them hot chocolate on rainy days, how his sister would help him with his math homework even though she was younger. Ray's grandmother shared stories about the months she'd known Ray's mother at the shelter, her determination to learn new skills, her joy when she felt Ray kick for the first time. The truth of Ray's past wasn't just in the DNA test or the legal documents. It was here, in these stories, in these treasured memories being shared. It was in the way Mr. Jung's eyes crinkled just like his when he laughed, in the gentle wisdom of his grandmother who had loved him without condition all these years. As the evening grew late, they ordered pizza, Mr. Jung confessing that despite his fancy kitchen, he was a terrible cook. They sat around the dining table, this unlikely family brought together by fate and a lost wallet, sharing stories and creating new memories. "You know," Ray's grandmother said, watching Ray and Mr. Jung laugh over a shared joke, "your mother would have loved this. She always wanted you to be surrounded by love. She just didn't realize how much love was already waiting." The city lights twinkled outside the windows, and inside, three hearts began to heal, brought together by truth, united by love, and bonded by the memory of a young woman who had touched all their lives in different ways. "I have a smile," Ray said suddenly, looking at another photo. "And her birthmark, and Uncle's laugh. Yes, Mr. Zhang smiled, but you have your grandmother's heart. That's the greatest gift of all. Spring had brought new beginnings to the city, and with it, changes that nobody could have predicted just a few months ago. Ray stood in the doorway of their new apartment, a modest but comfortable two-bedroom place just 15 minutes from his school. The morning sun streamed through real windows, not the narrow shelter slits he'd known for so long, and the smell of his grandmother's cooking filled the air. "Breakfast is ready," she called from their small but functional kitchen. She was wearing her cleaning uniform, but now she only worked one job during school hours. Mr. Zhang had insisted on helping them find stable housing and making sure Ray's grandmother could work reasonable hours while still maintaining her independence. "Coming, Grandma," Ray called back, grabbing his backpack. The backpack was new too, a gift from his uncle, along with proper school supplies and clothes that actually fit. But more valuable than any of these material things were the changes Ray saw in his grandmother's face. The worry lines had softened, replaced by smile wrinkles around her eyes. They sat down to eat breakfast together, something they'd never had time for before. "Mr. Parker called yesterday," his grandmother said, passing him a plate of eggs. "He says the shelter's new program is working well." Ray nodded, remembering how his uncle had listened when he talked about the shelter's struggles. Instead of just writing a check, Mr. Zhang had worked with the shelter directors to create sustainable programs, job training, childcare, and educational support. The place that had been their home for so long was now helping even more families find their feet. "Don't forget we're having dinner at your uncle's tonight," his grandmother reminded him. These weekly family dinners had become a cherished tradition. Sometimes they ate takeout. Mr. Zhang still hadn't improved his cooking skills. Sometimes Ray's grandmother cooked, but it was never about the food. It was about being together. After breakfast, Ray headed to school. The route was different now, but he still passed by some familiar faces. He always stopped to talk with Tommy and his mom, who were now in transitional housing thanks to the shelter's new programs. He'd wave to Mr. Parker, who still liked to sit near the subway entrance, not because he had to anymore, but because he enjoyed sharing his jazz stories with passers-by. At school, things had changed too. Ray was in advanced math now. Turns out he had inherited his uncle's head for numbers. But more importantly, he had the time and space to actually study, to join clubs, to just be a kid. His teachers had noticed the difference, not just in his grades, but in his confidence. After school, Ray often stopped by his uncle's office. He had his own access card now, and the security guards who had once looked at him with suspicion now greeted him with warm smiles. Sometimes he'd do his homework in the break room, where Mrs. Chen would share her homemade cookies and stories about when his mother worked there as a teenage intern. But it wasn't all perfect. Life rarely is. There were still adjustments to make, emotions to process, memories to reconcile. Some nights, Ray would find his grandmother looking at his mother's photographs with tears in her eyes. Other times, his uncle would get quiet, lost in thoughts of what if and if only. On this particular evening, as they gathered for their weekly dinner, Mr. Zhang had a surprise. He'd converted one of his spare rooms into a space for Ray, not to live in, but to have his own place when he visited. The walls were painted his favorite color, and on one wall hung a large photo of his mother, smiling that familiar smile. "I want you to know," Mr. Zhang said, watching Ray explore the room, "that this isn't about replacing what you have with your grandmother. It's about adding to it. Family isn't about substitution, it's about multiplication." Ray's grandmother nodded in agreement. "Your mother would be proud," she said softly, "not just of who you are, but of how we've all come together." They ordered pizza. Some traditions don't need changing, and sat in the living room, sharing stories and plans for the future. Ray had started a club at school to help other kids learn about financial responsibility, something his uncle was helping with. His grandmother was teaching cooking classes at the shelter on her days off. Mr. Zhang was working on expanding the shelter's programs to other cities. Later that night, as they drove home to their apartment, Ray watched the city lights blur past the car window. He thought about the wallet that had started it all, how one small moment of honesty had opened the door to so much more. But it wasn't really about the wallet, he realized. It was about the choices people make, the love they share, and the courage to embrace change while holding on to what matters most. "Grandma," he said quietly, "do you ever miss the shelter?" She glanced at him with understanding eyes. I miss some things, the community, the way everyone looked out for each other. But you know what? We can miss something while still being grateful for where we are now. That's part of growing up. Back home, Ray stood at his window, looking out at the city. Somewhere out there, other families were facing their own challenges, making their own choices, finding their own ways forward. He thought about his mother, wondering if she could see how her story had come full circle, how her brother and the woman she'd trusted with her baby had become a family, bound together by love and circumstance. On his desk sat the wooden box of his mother's belongings, now mixed with new treasures, photos of him with his grandmother and uncle, ticket stubs from their first baseball game together, the access card to his uncle's office. The past and present woven together into something new and beautiful. As he got ready for bed, Ray caught sight of his birthmark in the mirror, the same mark that had helped bring his family's story to light. Some might call it coincidence, but his grandmother had a different word for it: destiny. Sometimes, she told him, love finds its way home, no matter how long it takes. And she was right. Sometimes it takes a lost wallet, a birthmark, and a whole lot of courage to bring a family together. But in the end, it's not about the things we lose or find, it's about the hearts we touch along the way.